Experience has proven that one of the best weapons in the flat earther's arsenal is simple: the physical geometry of the world. Whenever taking aim to make a case for the stationary plane Earth in a skirmish with another force, hostile or otherwise, they will typically lead the discussion into some abstract theoretical area like the heavenly luminaries or images from NASA. The fact of the matter is, the shape of the world is not measured by gazing into the heavens or arguing about pictures of the world from the lying Freemasons of NASA. Ergo, such arguments like the sun and moon appear to be spheres, therefore the world must also be a sphere, doesn't hold water whatsoever. The dimensions of the heavenly luminaries simply don't apply to the world. The only reason they ever seemed to apply here on the ground was because the standard paradigm brainwashes all children that the night sky is filled with giant physical spheres, some of which are potential terra firma destinations. Even if the sun and moon are indeed spheres, which remains to be proven one way or another, the dimensions of these heavenly luminaries simply don't apply to the physical world. In order to prove the world's sphericity or lack thereof, we must measure for curvature here on the ground, not study the mysterious sources of light and intrigue which appear in the sky, yet remain perpetually beyond our reach. The professional liars at NASA and other so-called space agencies were chartered for the sole purpose of furthering the deception that leads us to believe that our world has been completely explored. The ancients were far from wise in their uniform description of the world, the heavens and the underworld, and the institution of science with a capital S is the supreme authority of truth in this world, as opposed to a process of logical discernment, science that is. The logic behind the claim, or the so-called logic that is, the sun and the moon appear to be spherical, therefore the world must also be spherical, is tantamount to the so-called logic behind the statement, tennis balls are spherical, therefore tennis courts must also be spherical too. Instead of measuring a tennis court for curvature, or lack thereof, we can just observe dozens or even hundreds of tennis balls, all of which are perfect spheres, proving, by this logic of many a glober, conclusively proving that the tennis court is clearly a sphere too. Case closed. Of course, this is beyond ridiculous, as one would obviously observe and measure the tennis court to establish whether or not the tennis court is a sphere, which of course it is not. I'd be lying if I said I hate to say it, so it brings me great satisfaction, as a connoisseur of all things ironic and darkly humorous, to point out this is exactly the argument used by Globers in regards to the sun or the moon's sphericity somehow transitively applying to the physical world here on the ground in reality. The fact of the matter is, we must measure the earth. The literal etymological meaning of the word geometry is measure the earth, and we must do so in order to determine its rotundity or lack thereof. One doesn't measure the tennis ball or dozens or even hundreds of tennis balls in order to determine the dimensions of the tennis court, and as such, one should not observe the sun or the moon or the wandering stars in order to determine the dimensions of the world. Since we are indeed very, very small in comparison to the world, it is a difficult task to measure the world for sphericity or necessary curvature if it was indeed a sphere. In order to do so, one must begin with some logical method of first establishing exactly how much curvature should be expected upon the world, assuming for argument's sake that it is indeed a sphere, and then begin measuring for the world's curvature to find out if it actually exists. Furthermore, while the world presents complications in the effort to prove curvature, in the form of hills and valleys, large bodies of water provide a much more suitable profile for such metrics, as water is free of topography, hills and valleys. Furthermore, standing non-tidal waters are better still than tidal waters, which are prone to the ebb and flow of tidal cycles, and wave troughs which cause optical or false horizons. So, to begin this exercise in geometry, let's assume that the world is a sphere, with an equatorial circumference of about 25,000 miles. Indeed, one thing Globers and Flurfers can agree on is the distance around the equator, so this figure is not up for debate, as far as I can tell. Of course, since I have yet to visit the equator, let alone circumnavigate it, the equatorial circumference of 25,000 miles is not something which I or some other flat earther has come up with on our own volition. The caveats we must post up in these discussions brings us no joy, for the record. It's worth mentioning that you will find very few, if any, globe Earth proponents who will humor a hypothesis which lies outside of their comfort zone. In fact, they will generally disregard any such experiment or demonstration or even conversation, for everyone knows the Earth is a ball, so why would we waste our time testing the conventional wisdom for something as ridiculous as geological rotundity? All flat Earth proponents will necessarily partake in such exercises to test the conventional wisdom without a second thought. This is by the very nature of flat earthers, as we've necessarily underwent a sort of metamorphosis which begins with questioning the conventional wisdom. The essence of science, in fact, which is humoring hypothesis, no matter how strange or uncomfortable the process may be, in the attempt to disprove some conventional wisdom or another. By doing this, we can only come closer to the truth, either by enhancing and reinforcing our current understanding, or, as in the case of flat Earth, surprisingly overturning some carved-in-stone conventional wisdom with new facts or new methods of viewing the world which were not on the proverbial radar previously. Beginning with these assumptions, we can use simple geometry and spherical trigonometry to calculate exactly how curved the world should be before we can go about measuring the world to see whether or not such curvature actually exists in reality. Thankfully, that work has been done manually over 150 years ago and confirmed by computer software such as AutoCAD. The first person to determine the hip pocket formula used by all flat earthers was Dr. Samuel Rowbotham, author of the groundbreaking book Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe, written back in 1865. I'll put a card right here to the audiobook of Zetetic, which I recorded a few years back for your convenience, and I'll put a link at the end. So, reading an excerpt from Zetetic Astronomy, starting at page 7, if the Earth is a globe and 25,000 miles in circumference, the surface of all standing water must have a certain degree of convexity. Every part must be an arc of a circle, curvating from the summit at the rate of 8 inches per mile multiplied by the square of the distance. This may be sufficiently understood. The following quotation is given from Encyclopedia Britannica, Leveling. If a line which crosses the plumb line at right angles be continued for any considerable length, it will rise above the Earth's surface, the Earth being globular, and this rising will be as the square of the distance to which the said right line is produced. That is to say, it is raised 8 inches very nearly above the Earth's surface at 1 mile's distance, 4 times as much, or 32 inches, at the distance of 2 miles, 9 times as much, or 72 inches, at the distance of 3 miles. This is owing to the globular figure of the Earth, and this rising is the difference between the true and apparent levels, the curve of the Earth being the true level, and the tangent to it the apparent level. Looking at figure 1, let BD be a small portion of the Earth's circumference, whose center of curvature is point A, and consequently all the points of this arc will be on a level. But a tangent, BC, meeting the vertical line AD and C, will be the apparent level at the point B, and therefore DC is the difference between the apparent and the true level at the point B. The distance CD must be deducted from the observed height to have the true difference of level, or the differences between the distances of 2 points from the surface of the Earth or from the center of curvature A. But we shall afterwards see how this correction may be avoided altogether in certain cases. To find an expression for CD, we have Euclid, 3rd book, 36 prop, which proves that BC squared equals CD times 2AD times CD. But since in all cases of leveling, CD is exceedingly small compared with 2AD, we may safely neglect CD squared, and then BC squared equals 2AD times CD, or CD equals BC times 2 divided by 2AD. Hence, the depression of the true level is equal to the square of the distance divided by twice the radius of the curvature of the Earth. For example, taking a distance of 4 miles, the square of 4 equals 16, and putting down twice the radius of the Earth's curvature, as in round figures about 8,000 miles, we make the depression on 4 miles equals 16 divided by 8,000 of a mile equals 16 times 1760 over 8,000. Yards equals 175 over 50. Yards equals 528 over 50 feet, or rather, better than 10 1/4 feet. Or, if we take the mean radius of the Earth as the mean radius of its curvature, and consequently 2 AD equals 7,912 miles, then 5,280 feet being 1 mile, we shall have CD, the expression in inches, 5280 times 12 times BC times 2 divided by 7912 equals 8,008 BC squared inches. The preceding remarks suppose the visual ray, CB, to be a straight line, whereas on account of the unequal densities of the air at different distances from the Earth, the rays of light are incurvated by refraction. The effect of this is to lessen the difference between the true and apparent levels, but in such an extremely variable and uncertain manner that if any constant or fixed allowance is made for it in formula or in tables, it will often lead to a greater error than what it was intended to obviate. For though the refraction may, at a mean, compensate for about 1/7 of the curvature of the Earth, it sometimes exceeds 1/5, and at other times doesn't amount to 1/15. We have therefore made no allowance for refraction in the foregone formula. If the Earth is a globe, there cannot be a question that, however irregular the land may be in form, the water must have a convex surface, and as the difference between the true and apparent level or the degree of curvature would be 8 inches in 1 mile, and in every succeeding mile 8 inches multiplied by the square of the distance, there can be no difficulty in detecting either its actual existence or proportion. Experiments made upon the sea have been objected to on account of its constantly changing altitude and the existence of banks and channels, which produce a crowding of the waters, currents, and other irregularities. Okay, so ending the excerpt from Zetetic Astronomy. Assuming the world is a ball with a circumference of about 25,000 miles, or a spherical radius of about 4,000 miles, we should expect to see a specific amount of vertical descent due to curvature, especially over bodies of water, where topography won't obstruct the line of sight. In other words, as an object moves away from you, the observer, it should drop lower in proportion with the distance gained at a given rate, assuming the world is a ball, of course. It's important to reiterate that it is not I who's coming up with these numbers for the ball Earth. Such things can be found in any textbook pertaining to geological dimensions. The claim regarding the equator being about 25,000 miles long is not a claim of my own, but a figure which can be agreed upon by all sides of this argument. The only reason I'm mentioning such caveats and point is because I've had several people argue that it could be that my numbers are wrong, and how do I know the circumference of the world is 25,000 miles? Face and palm. Ugh. The truth is, I don't know the circumference is 25,000 miles around. I've never circumnavigated the world, but all sources from Gerardus Mercator of map fame to NASA and every textbook ever written on the topic purport the world as having a 25,000 mile spherical circumference, which is the figure that we'll go with as our base metric to prove. Assuming the Earth is a ball, it would necessarily display a specific amount of vertical descent due to curvature, which should be measurable and demonstrable. In fact, it should be obvious, were it indeed the truth. Every science class in the world would be performing generic experiments to prove it. As an observer gains distance from some large object like a lighthouse or a skyscraper or a mountain peak, such objects should physically decrease their elevation relative to that observer. At a given point, the Earth's curvature would obscure the tip-top of such distant objects. If such objects can be seen with the naked eye or with the aid of a telescope, then we have a very good evidence to add to the never-ending pile of evidence against the ball Earth theory. This is not something where emotions can get in the way of our endeavor. Either the Earth is a ball which obscures distant objects beneath the horizon, or it isn't. Very cut and dried, although refraction does become a variable which can muddy the discussion, but we'll get to that later. We should quickly ask ourselves, why is it that we were not taught about such geometry in school? Why didn't we have such exercises to prove the world's curvature? You'd think that every middle school or high school math class would include a section where they estimate the vertical descent of objects due to Earth curvature according to an observer on some given ball. They might even have several different sized spheres and a variety of little observers on a pop quiz. So like an ant on a basketball or a lizard on a beach ball. And at the end of the semester, the class might take a field trip to the ocean or some large lake where they could demonstrate the method to prove Earth's curvature by some practical experiment. Unfortunately, no such curriculum exists for one very good reason. Because no such curvature exists, and so any class exercise dedicated to establishing the expected geological curvature per mile and measuring for it would chuck out newbie flat earthers by the droves, something wholly unthinkable to the federally controlled educational system. And of course, the cat would be out of the bag for all the teachers, too. Instead, the curriculum is devoid of any such exercise or experiment. This is no surprise, as classrooms are dedicated to teaching children what to think and what to believe, as opposed to showing them how to think for themselves, how to exercise discernment, how to use the scientific method for practical purposes, other than passing the test by arriving at conclusions which are carved in stone as correct. The institution is thus cemented in the student's mind as the authority on truth and correctness, while the average person's ability to reason atrophies, and the student's ability to regurgitate factoids becomes the metric by which their success in the classroom is gauged. The school system is designed to produce essential slaves, just smart enough to function in our society, and just daft enough not to question the authority of the institution. Anyone asking tough questions which disagree with the curriculum or, God forbid, disagreeing with the institution are stigmatized and do not advance through the degrees of education. The truth is, the only group of people interested in measuring for geological curvature and establishing such an equation that we can use for exercises to prove it are flat Earth proponents. All flat earthers were once globe Earth believers who went through the process of humoring this admittedly bizarre and unusual hypothesis and came out the other side social pariahs with a contagious case of flat Earth cooties. The reason globe Earth proponents are not espoused to the curvature formula and the related exercises of physically measuring the world is because, well, they are now flat earthers. Globe Earth belief is mutually exclusive to such exercises because, well, the world is a stationary plane. As a youngster growing up, I remember my father telling me that an object can only be seen in the distance for some given number of miles due to the Earth's curvature. However, the topic was never really discussed much further than that, and I thought it was an interesting point to ponder. Of course, we now understand that it isn't curvature which obscures the line of sight towards distant objects. Instead, objects in the distance vanish due to the subjective laws of perspective, coupled with the physical phenomenon of refraction. We live in a world with an atmosphere which entails a gradient density of air, with the higher density air finding its state of equilibrium at rest lower to the ground, and decreasing density atmosphere naturally resting at higher elevations. The reason for this natural orientation of air density is the topic of an entirely separate video, but for the purposes of this one, suffice to say that our world naturally stacks matter with the highest density matter below the lighter, less dense matter, with a gradient density diminishing to practically nothing at the elevation of, say, weather balloons some 20 or 30 miles up. This density gradient of atmosphere creates conditions which cause inbound light from the sun, stars, and the moon to alter its rectilinear course of travel due to the measurable phenomenon called refraction. While light may travel in perfectly rectilinear paths in a vacuum, It simply doesn't travel in perpetual straight lines when passing through varying density or temperature medium, such as our atmosphere. This causes an illusion of sorts, which makes distant objects appear in a different elevation than they actually are. This applies to distant objects near the horizon as well as objects overhead, such as the heavenly luminaries. So there is an apparent position of the moon overhead and an actual position of the moon overhead, which cannot be seen with the eye. The two of which, these positions, are different directions in space. So if you point to where you see the moon or where you see the sun, you will not actually be pointing in the direction of the moon or the sun. Only at the point when it is perfectly overhead, 90 degrees above you at the 12 o'clock position, per se, are the actual sun and the apparent sun in unison. The refraction index is 0.0 whenever the sun is directly overhead. The amount of this apparent displacement of a distant object due to refraction varies depending on a number of conditions, including the makeup of the air, particulates, temperature, humidity, and the angle of attack of the light through the atmosphere, where the least amount of refraction will be present at 90 degrees, and increasing amount of refraction as that angle strays away from 90 degrees. So when the sun or the moon appear to set beneath the horizon, much of the vertical descent of these objects is only apparent and is indeed due to refraction, combined, of course, with the subjective operation of perspective. In other words, when the moon is seen near the horizon, it isn't actually near the horizon. It merely appears that way due to the perspective and in large part due to refraction. In fact, the sun and the moon operate on a singular plane. We'll call it the astronomical plane or the astral plane. Never do any of the celestial objects come anywhere near the ground. This optical phenomenon is the perfect setting to naturally mislead us into the belief of a ball Earth. As ironic as it is, it's the truth. On the local level, light certainly appears to travel in straight lines, and it more or less does. This gives us a false sense of understanding to the macro level. For on a large scale, light simply doesn't travel in straight line paths, and a variety of perturbances affect the path of light. Using a laser pointer, you can demonstrate just how much light can indeed stray from the straight line path. Using a fish tank filled with water, simply add some sugar without stirring to create a density gradient atmosphere within the fish tank on a much smaller scale. The other big part of the sunset or the moonset that we're describing is, of course, perspective. While the sun and moon indeed adhere to the subjective operations of perspective, they are quite unlike anything we can tangibly work with on small scales here in reality, on the ground. The reason being is the sun and moon are quite distant from we little observers, and yet they are still visible. Estimates have it that the sun and moon are approximately 3,500 miles in altitude in the flat Earth paradigm, with a diameter of about 35 miles each. These figures were gleaned using the same method as Eratosthenes, who around 300 BC is credited with being the first person to estimate the circumference of the ball Earth. Using the same method as Eratosthenes, which entails a clever application of the Pythagorean theorem, flat Earth proponents have come to these numbers. Although I don't necessarily agree with them per se, we'll use them just for the purpose of this video in describing how the operations of perspective apply to the sun and moon quite differently than anything else we can possibly find in reality. So assuming these figures, again, 3,500 miles give or take distance to the sun and moon, 35-mile diameter of the sun and moon, assuming these figures are something close to correct, which I do believe is quite possible, that they are actually close to the actual size and distance, that is, if the sun and moon are physical objects at all, then we cannot liken the sun and moon to any other object found in nature. I mean, think about it. Can you remember observing any object that is 30 miles in diameter? Can you remember observing any object that is some 3,500 miles away? That would be like viewing an object when you're standing in Virginia, viewing an object that's somewhere in California. I mean, or past California, right? It's unheard of. It's unthinkable. Of course, then the answer to both questions would be no, and so we have unique objects indeed in terms of the sun and the moon. As such large and distant objects move away from us, they are not going to apparently diminish in angular size by a very large factor when compared to objects like birds or planes as they fly away from us in the sky. Again, we're dealing with objects which are possibly 35 miles in diameter, some 3,000 miles in altitude. As the sun is only traversing about 6,000 miles from the time that it's overhead to the time that it sets, the angular size diminishment would be minimal, as we're dealing with a very large object which is a great distance away. Furthermore, any apparent diminishment in its angular size that we might see in a vacuum environment, the atmosphere indeed behaves as a bit of a lens, which seems to have the effect of magnifying these distant objects. So as the sun gains distance from the observer, any apparent diminishment in its angular size would be canceled out by this magnification effect from the atmosphere, adding to the perfect environment the world appears to be for deceiving people. It's almost as if the world was created as the perfect place to trick people into believing that they live on a ball. The operations of perspective dictate that an object above your line of sight will appear to drop lower towards your line of sight as distance is gained, with the center point being the horizon or the vanishing point. At a sufficient distance, the atmosphere itself behaves as a sort of convex lens through which we observe all the heavenly luminaries. The atmospheric lens is subjective to each observer and varies from day to day, depending on a number of factors mentioned previously. The lens of the atmosphere doesn't affect local objects to a great extent, but at great distances, it indeed drastically affects the apparent position and the size of objects such as the sun or the moon. If you've ever observed clouds which fill the sky straight to the horizon, you'll notice that the clouds overhead are certainly at a similar altitude as distant clouds which appear near the horizon. Now, we know, of course, that the clouds near the horizon are not actually near the ground. This is purely an optical phenomenon, which is caused by, again, the operation of perspective as well as refraction. In a sense, the clouds are behaving similar to the sun or the moon, as they are beholden to these two factors as they set. Were it not for the atmosphere refracting and magnifying the light, the clouds near the horizon might appear much higher in the sky and much smaller. The distant clouds near the horizon appear to meet with the ground because perspective dictates they will apparently drop lower and lower proportionally with distance from the observer, and I submit the refraction of the inbound light from the clouds causes their apparent position to drop even lower than their actual position. We know full well that the clouds are nowhere near the ground and certainly not passing through the horizon, but due to these conditions, we are given a natural optical illusion of just that. Of course, the sun and the moon are far larger and far more distant than clouds, and so they are in a bit of a league of their own. However, we can gain a better understanding of how perspective and refraction can affect the light from the celestial objects, which exist completely outside the medium of the atmosphere, rendering them as something altogether foreign and unique to our eye. The primary point to glean from all that was the fact that our eyes, while they serve us well on the local level, can be tricked by optical illusions, especially when dealing with heavenly luminaries. They exist and operate on a single plane, if they are physical objects at all. However, optical illusions trick us into believing that they rise in the east and set in the west. In truth, the only reason they rise and set is because of perspective and refraction. Even if the sun and moon are physical objects, which they very well may be, their dimensions prove exactly nothing about the shape and nature of the physical world. So getting back on point to the matter at hand, the expected amount of curvature on the ball Earth should be 8 inches of vertical descent per mile squared. For every mile that an object is distant from the observer, it should vertically descend 8 inches multiplied by the mile squared. Take a look at this chart for a better understanding of this expected exponential vertical descent of distant objects due to geological curvature. This was first published and taught by Dr. Robotham, again the author of Zetetic Astronomy, in 1865, and was confirmed by modern flat Earth proponents using software like AutoCAD. In all the years that we spend in school, be it the standard K through 12 or even college, the ball Earth is preached as gospel, but never will you find curriculum which teaches one how you might go about proving the Earth's sphericity by estimating what amount of curvature we should expect, let alone how we should go about proving it. Why is it that flat Earth proponents are the ones who have espoused such ventures in basic geometry? The reason is simple. Of course, the Earth doesn't have such curvature, for it is a plane, not a sphere. The only curvature we find is that of light waves, or light rays, which simply do not travel in straight line paths as one might assume. This error begins with Eratosthenes, who, again around 300 BC, estimated the Earth's circumference by observations of the Sun, using spherical trigonometry to conclude the figures we use more or less to this very day. The truth is, Eratosthenes assumed the light traveling from the Sun to the ground was following a straight line path. His brilliance as an astronomer and mathematician are only equaled by his ignorance of refraction, which wouldn't even be discovered until about 1500 years later, according to conventional history. So it wasn't the world curving beneath rectilinear light waves, but instead light waves curving over a planar world. Either way, his numbers work, although the conclusions gleaned therein are a world apart. Eratosthenes conducted a demonstration wherein observations of the Sun at two different points, Syene and Alexandria, give data which was plugged into a formula which relied upon an assumption. That assumption being that the Earth was a ball, and that light always travels in straight lines. We can, however, take the same data, being the elevation angle of the Sun at these two given locations at the same time during the equinox, and assume a flat Earth with a local Sun, and glean a completely different answer. Both of these answers are mathematically correct, however, both of them cannot be true, of course. If we assume the Earth is a ball and the Sun is some 100 million miles away, as proclaimed in the standard paradigm, then Eratosthenes' method can be used to estimate the size of the ball Earth. On the other hand, if we assume the world is a plane, then Eratosthenes' method can be used to estimate the size and distance of the Sun and the Moon. This comes with yet another caveat, which is to say, we must consider the effect which refraction and atmospheric lensing has on this trigonometry, which simply cannot work in either scenario, as trig calculations only work if the lines of your triangle are straight. Since we know for a fact that the light coming from the Sun is being perturbed by a number of factors, not least of which is atmospheric lensing and refraction, then any figures gleaned using Eratosthenes' method are merely anecdotal, and while they are a good starting point for hip pocket calculations or a rough understanding of the world, they shouldn't be used as precise measurements, be the world a plane or a sphere. Many people find it hard to determine what difference it makes whether the Earth is a ball or a plane. What motive could there possibly be to trick everyone into believing such an absurd lie? What difference does it make in one's day-to-day life whether the Earth is a ball or a plane? The fact of the matter is, it really makes no difference at all. That is, the physical properties of the world and its shape. Such details will not affect the day-to-day life of really anyone in the world. So what does make a difference, in my opinion, is the entire paradigm which comes with the ball Earth theory, which places practically zero significance in the world in the grand scheme of things, as the universe is practically infinite and is allegedly filled with billions and trillions of planets and solar systems similar to our own, if not far greater than our own. But when we realize the world is a plane which is fixed and immovable, the Sun and the Moon and the stars are merely secondary, minor features above the world, and nothing is analogous to the world in the whole universe, not even close, our world and thus ourselves become far more relevant, far more important, special, and unique in the grand scheme of things. When we realize that all the science fiction programming over the last few generations is simply fictitious propaganda, fantasy, designed to sap our sense of self-worth, it's almost as if we were placed here in this mysterious world for a very specific purpose, and at some point we were deceived into the current state of believing we are of little to no significance. Infinite space theory attempts to sever our connection and understanding of ourselves and thus of our Creator, and our entire lives become insignificant in the vast infinitude of everything. Our curious and pioneering spirit is for naught, it would seem, as there is simply no chance anyone will ever leave the physical reality confined to this world. NASA and the belief in other terra firma worlds in the sky becomes laughable fantasy, and the sublime preciousness of life and love come into focus with the realization of the flat Earth truth. Under the standard paradigm, all ancient cultures, and especially the goat herders of the Fertile Crescent who penned the Bible, are well-meaning ignoramuses who believed in things like heavens above and the underworld below, which were created by God for some specific purpose. The standard shtick is one where the entirety of human history is nothing more than a small ripple in the corner of some obscure galaxy. All of our collective achievements amount to the endeavors of an anthill, according to the standard worldview. We have been tricked into worshiping material things of no actual worth, and the truly important things like love, happiness, fellowship, and exploration of the unknown areas of the world are hardly considered worth a hill of beans. We've come to an extremely important crossroads in human history. After Lord knows how many generations of insidious deception, we have broken through the lies of some wicked deceiver and have begun the process of revelation. The world is alight with the spirit of discernment, where the authority on what is true and correct is no longer found in some book or some institution, but within ourselves. We are no longer satisfied with memorizing factoids and regurgitating them later for a good grade on the test. Practically all of the highly esteemed institutions on this world have been found to be rife with erroneous dogma, which is being exposed and corrected at an astonishing rate. Everything from all flavors of theoretical science, history, and religion have been exposed as deceptions, or at least containing a great amount of deceptions, cleverly crafted to imprison our minds and our spirits. Now that this spirit has been unlocked and unleashed, the world has become a place which once again holds mysteries and frontiers which we need to be focusing on, collectively. For generations we've been misled into believing that we need not waste our time exploring beyond the known boundaries of our world, for there's nothing to see in, say, the Antarctic. We've been misled into believing that the frontier is actually in the sky, in space, which is nothing more than a laughable fantasy, propaganda which has ensnared the minds of entire generations. Now we are freed of this prison of the globe, and yet we still have one final step to take. The step where we are taken seriously in the world. We flat earthers are taken seriously in the world, and where we can focus our efforts on the actual frontier, not in the sky. If we could take the budget of, say, NASA and redirect it towards some actual frontier, some attainable frontier, and focus it on actual science as opposed to the theoretical nonsense, think of the strides we could make in progress. The entire infinite space theory is now out the window, meaning the world is of sublime importance in the grand scheme of things, and the stars overhead are merely secondary features of the world itself. This means that people are unique, special, and of sublime importance, and we've been insidiously tricked into believing the lies of evolution in order to separate us from our true purpose and our origins. If only we could help our brothers and sisters to snap out of the hypnotic and depressed state inherently tied to the infinite space paradigm, we could make huge strides towards a new golden age where the truly important things in the world become valuable once again, and the lying hierarchy and control of this world falls flat on its face.